Good. Great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies. I'm Laura Westengard, LAURAWESTGARD. I think I know what's happening. That there is a delay on the Zoom. And it's playing, we're hearing the Zoom. So we need to somehow turn that. Also, I guess I'm going to keep talking and see if I have an echo.
And if they can hear you out there.
Yeah, I'm checking that. I want to make all sorts of jokes, but I know then I'm going to hear my own jokes.
Yeah.
It's kind of terrifying. Sorry, Monica.
No, it's okay.
Okay, it sounds like they are hearing us now on YouTube.
Okay.
That's good. Oh, what if, can we turn off the mic out of? Okay. I am trying now. Ooh. Okay. What are?
What about lowering the volume?
Lowering the volume from the. Can you hear me now? Well, I don't seem to be echoing, so let's continue. Okay, so finally, I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Monica B. Pearl, who is a senior lecturer, associate professor in 20th century American literature and film at the University of Manchester in the UK. She has written extensively on AIDS representation, including her book, AIDS Literature and Gay Identity, The Literature of Loss. Her most recent publication is a short essay on the UK AIDS TV show, It's a Sin, in the European Journal of Cultural Studies. A brief recent account of her experience as a member of ACT UP New York was also published recently in Radical History Review. Tonight, Monica is going to be talking about her work in progress, Where is Your Rage? AIDS Generations. And I look forward to hearing her ideas and engaging with her and all of you in conversation tonight. So I will turn it over to Monica.
Thanks so much,
Welcome.
Laura, and thank you very much. Thank you to Clags, to Laura. Thank you to Kat and Maria for sign language interpreting. Can people hear us now? Yes. Okay. Great. This is a work in progress. I'm really happy to be inaugurating this series, and it's why I have allowed as much time for discussion as delivery, though saying that, I might slow down a little bit now that I know it's going to be interpreted, ASL interpreted. But to that end, I have cut it down rather ruthlessly, almost in half. So it's not even all my thoughts yet, even the in progress thoughts. So yeah, the title is Where is Your Rage? AIDS Generations. And I started with a quotation from Vito Russo's speech at the ACT UP Action in Albany, New York, May 9th, 1988. AIDS really is a test of us, he says, as a people. When future generations ask what we did in this crisis, we're going to have to tell them that we were out here today. And we have to leave the legacy to those generations of people who will come after us. While it is not the AIDS crisis that introduced the concept among gay men and lesbians or anyone that the younger generation just don't know how good and easy they have it, nevertheless, those who lived through and survived the early emergency years of the AIDS crisis and the toxic homophobia that caused it and sustained it, feel perhaps particularly alienated from their more guileless fledgling brethren. And I make a note here that when I refer in this essay, in this talk, to the years after the AIDS crisis, I sometimes couch it in the acknowledgement that I am referring to the emergency years of about 1981 to 1996, when HIV infection and AIDS was almost always a death sentence. And for much of that time, how the illness developed or was even transmitted was a mystery. Even when I do not couch the phrase AIDS crisis as belonging particularly to that time, I am fully aware that the AIDS crisis is not over. Indeed, this essay is concerned with the myriad registers in which it is undeniably not over. It is a paradoxical discourse that those who fight for progress and liberation can feel deflated and resentful when younger beneficiaries of that toil do not acknowledge it, show appreciation for it, or pitch in to keep it going. In fact, we might say that part of the liberation fight is precisely to free future generations of such constant concerns, even while knowing that the struggle never ends. The achievement of what looks like liberation is never the last step, as it might appear. Unlike those who fought for and have lived through other recent American liberation struggles, those who endured and survived the AIDS crisis lost many friends and lovers and comrades. And as Freud frames it in his essay on mourning, not only actual people, but also an ideal. Myriad achievements were gained, some civil and legal rights, some cultural and familial acceptance, an erosion in pariah status, and sometimes more emotional recognition, but at the expense of literal lives. How this is enacted and represented in culture is pertinent, especially when we can see waves and shifts and how that history and its aftermath are displayed, and whether it is done for laughs, for tears, or stoking of anger. I've noted elsewhere that the initial post-AIDS, that is, post-pharmaceutical threshold fictional discourse, was thematized around survival and the sudden novelty of aging. For people with AIDS who were able to benefit from the newly devised pharmaceutical cocktail of life-sustaining HIV/AIDS drugs and were pulled back from the brink of death, there was the new prospect, often the shock of all the normal exigencies of life and growing old, standard aches, pains, illnesses, senescence. Anger over AIDS itself is not new, of course, but in those emergency years, it was articulated most vociferously in activism and felt and expressed constantly, certainly in daily life, yet not so much in the cultural texts of the moment. And just to point out very strongly, cultural analysis is what I'm doing here and what I do. And that will hopefully be part of the discussion, maybe what the difference is between finding something in culture and finding it in the real life outside of culture. The forceful locution of this talk's title, "Where is Your Rage?" suggests a movement that wished to incite fury over helplessness, anger over apathy. In light of the old labor movement maxim, "Don't mourn, organize," the philosophy of ACT UP was mourn, organize, and fight back. Turn your grief into anger, ACT UP insisted. As ACT UP member Douglas Crimp resolved in his negotiation of these very spirits and affects of the AIDS crisis, it must be both mourning and militancy, he concludes in his essay with that very title. ACT UP is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and its cri de coeur was that we were united in anger, channeling it and galvanizing it. "Where is your rage?" comes from an ACT UP protest. The words of the rhetorical question were printed in bold red on the handout screed for the 1994 Pride Parade, ACT UP at Spirit of Stonewall Alternative March, which marked the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. The verso of the sheet asked, "How many of us will be alive for Stonewall 35? Because so many pre-AIDS gay texts involved loss, there was going into the AIDS crisis already a legacy of unacknowledged and uncondoled grief. In fact, none of the big emotions have ever really been publicly and often therefore even privately available for gay people. Not love, not grief, and not anger. Love was forbidden, grief over losses before AIDS has been strangled and squelched. Public evidence and erasure of this reaches its apotheosis in the way mainstream AIDS obituaries habitually occluded the intimate survivors of those who died. Since about 2016, there has emerged a cultural preoccupation with what the young do not know about AIDS. This following example is not as angry as subsequent texts are, yet it conveys an essential awareness of a discord between what older and younger generations of gays know of the experience of AIDS and the AIDS crisis. The play The Inheritance by Matthew Lopez, which opened in the West End in 2018 and moved to Broadway in 2019, illuminates a feeling of disconnection between generations of gay men, those who endured and survived AIDS and those for whom it is not anymore a horror of daily life. The very play, as suggested by the title, centers on the questions of generations by making the concept of inheritance the issue of what the legacies and inheritances are among and between gay men in recent years. Thus, the most poignant moment of The Inheritance is the scene that explains to a post-AIDS generation what it was actually like to live during the crisis, when Eric, in his 30s, is made to understand by his elder gay friend Walter what it was to be a gay man in the AIDS crisis not very many years before. Although this play does not contain the rage that stirs in other texts of the day, as I will come to, it vividly portrays what knowledge and feeling is experienced as missing in younger gay generations and what in the other texts makes the older gays so mad. When the character Eric says to old Walter about the days of AIDS, "I can't imagine what those years were like. I don't even know how to. I can understand what it was, but I cannot possibly feel what it was." Walter calmly replies, "Tell me the name of your closest friends." Eric says, "Tristan." Walter, imagine that Tristan is dead. Name another. Jasper is also dead. Jason has been at St. Vincent's for 2 weeks. The toxoplasmosis has left him with dementia. Jason, his husband. Because they cannot legally be married, abandonment is simpler. Jason has left him. Then the ensemble of the play becomes a chorus of individual voices, each vocalizing these next lines as they ethereally emerge into a shadowy stage like ghosts. So the young men as an ensemble each say, Patrick is dead, Alex is dead, Colin is dead, Lucas is infected, Zach is dying from pneumocystis carinii, Chris is healthy, his partner has just been diagnosed. You visited Mark in the hospital. Tonight you will visit Will. Tomorrow is Eddie's funeral. Michael's body is covered with KS lesions. Jeffrey is infected but asymptomatic. Nick is dead. Daniel is dead. Stephen is infected. Brian's partner has peripheral neuropathy. He screams in pain at the slightest touch. Scott is in Paris hoping to get HPA 23. Javier went home to die in his mother's house. Jonathan's family won't take him back. Brandon is dead. Matthew is dead. Leo is infected. Kurt is infected, but he doesn't know. David, his partner, will find out first. Frankie's sister calls you to tell you he's died. Adam has disappeared altogether. Philip is dead. Trevor is dead. Kevin is infected. Rumors fly about incarcerations of gay men as a precaution. Politicians begin to openly discuss mass quarantines. There's talk of outlawing homosexuality, rumors of deportations. Anti-gay violence is on the rise. The American public becomes galvanized by the epidemic, not against the illness, but against the people who have it. Businesses cancel health insurance policies for employees with AIDS. States pass legislation requiring wholesalers to divulge if a person with AIDS has ever lived there. Sam is dead, Mark is dead, Miguel is infected, Paul has it, Ben has it, Carlos has it, Wesley is dead, Caleb is dead, David is dead, James is dead, Andrew is dead, Jacob is dead. Walter has the final word in this scene, concluding that he has now recreated the experience of that time. This is what it was.
Are you able to slow down a little bit? Because when
Yes.
you're reading, it's not enough.
Walter has the final word in the scene, concluding that he has now recreated the experience of that time. This is what it was. It is worth quoting the scene at length to show the lengths it actually takes to reprise, remind, and introduce to the character Eric, and through him, the audience, the experience, the devastations, the shock, and then perhaps the numbness of the losses of the AIDS crisis. Other texts of this time, as I will show, are not so gentle and are not aiming for this kind of sentiment or empathy or education. In those texts, they hear the 20 or 30 something say they don't know or understand, and they combust. While AIDS is not always the spark in these subsequent examples, it nevertheless always ends up being the load of the bomb that blows. In the latest incarnation of Tales of the City, for example, the series on Netflix of 2019, streaming 26 years after the initial television show of the same name aired, a dinner party is the setting of the conflagration. It occurs in episode 4. It starts in bitchy banter among some gay older men about their travel exploits. Michael, Mouse, that's his nickname, the main gay protagonist from the very beginning of the series, has brought his young lover Ben to a Tony dinner party in San Francisco. The conversation is rapid and rebarbative. Can you believe this one has never been to Peru? And quickly suggestive. The best thing about Machu Picchu, the Sherpas, their calves. You just stare at their gorgeous legs. Then comes a segue to a story of searching for a particular bar in, quote, this totally sketchy part of Mexico City, and discovering it to be, quote, full of trannies, a Mexican tranny club, followed by general hilarity and laughter. Young Ben puts a hand on the arm of the man who has said this and remonstrates tentatively. I don't think we use that word. The banter and laughter around the table is completely silenced. Finally, someone breaks the silence with, sorry? Ben very awkwardly says, tranny, it's offensive, and using it to insult each other, that's really offensive. One guest uselessly attempts to divert attention. Does anyone want more wine? But another guest interposes, I just don't really appreciate that we have to be policed. And another adds, at a fucking gay dinner party. Is this a Bordeaux, Michael attempts? And there's another effort to return the conversation to Machu Picchu. What you call someone is important. It's about dignity. It's about visibility, Ben tries to explain. And then comes invective from the dinner guest played by Stephen Spinella. The character is unnamed in the script. Let me tell you something about dignity and visibility. How old are you? With arms crossed, Ben answers 28. Replying at first calmly, Spinella says, okay, any so-called privilege that we happen to enjoy at this moment was one, okay? And by that I mean clawed, tooth and nail, from a society that didn't give two shits whether we lived or died, and indeed did not care when all our friends started to die. When I was 28, I wasn't going to fucking dinner parties, I was going to funerals, 3 or 4 a week. All of us were. Solemn nods around the table. Ben offers, I understand, I do. Spinella with growing heat and rancor, oh, you do? Really? Why? Because you saw Angels in America? Fuck that, fuck that. You have no idea. This world that you get to live in with your safe spaces and your intersectionality. Someone adds gay marriage, another chimes in fucking without condoms. Spinella then delivers the final fulmination, breaking the party up. All of it. This entitlement you now have to dignity and visibility as a gay person, do you even know where that came from? Do you know who built that world? Do you know the cost of that progress? No, of course not, because it would be more than your generation could ever bear to comprehend. So if a bunch of old queens wants to sit around a table and use the word tranny, I will not be told off by someone who wasn't fucking there. Ben excuses himself and leaves the table. There is silence among those remaining at the table. Michael follows Ben out. This indebtedness and thrall to Angels in America is no less in evidence in another text that raises the rage of what the next generation of gays do not acknowledge or know to a new level, and shows it in its very title, The Angel of History, the 2016 novel by Ravi Alameddine. In Alameddine's novel, the main character Jacob, a gay Yemeni-born writer living in San Francisco, uncontainably rails against those who do not hold the knowledge and sense of the devastation of the AIDS years. Over several pages in a section of the novel called Walter Benjamin that describes in the first person Jacob going to, quote, have dinner with my roommate Odette and her girlfriend Sue in a crowded restaurant and being, quote, stopped by 2 young gay writers, 2 rude writers, both remaining seated in the deafening cacophony as Tom something and something Bernhard was all I could remember of their names, 2 artists of the Nouveau Bland movement whose manifesto consists of defending the rights of white gay boys to have dating anxieties and live homo happily ever after. By the way, I did submit some of these phrases in advance to the sign language interpreter, so which was actually fun to do. The writers engage Jacob in conversation by referring to a recent book of Joan Didion's, commenting, can you imagine she lost her husband and within a year and a half lost her daughter as well? How horrifying is that? At this, Jacob fumes. Can you imagine? And alarm bells woke from me from a 20-year nap. It was instantaneous. Zeus launched crackling thunderbolts and Molotov cocktails in Rip Van Winkle's head. I began yelling. Her husband died? You think that's horrifying? You feel sorry for her? She's lived a full life. I had 6 friends die in a 6-month period, half a dozen of my close friends, including my partner. We were nothing but babies. Where was she when we were dying? Where were you, you motherfuckers? Adrenaline rushed through my veins, anarchic, atavistic, delicious, a sheen of sweat on my palms, tingles on my forearms, rage in my voice. Mid-rant, Jacob realizes that in fact, even as I was yelling, the answer to the question of where were they in the AIDS crisis was, quote, barely in middle school then, probably 8 or 10, Yet this realization does not assuage his fury. I wanted to feel sorry, but I couldn't. I just could not. I was in the midst of an amygdala hijacking. My sanity deserted me. All I had left was rage, long lost rage. How can you not know your history? I yelled over and over. You with your righteous apathy. How can you allow the world to forget us, to delete our existence, the grand illusion of queer history? His closing bolt of accusation is this: all AIDS books are out of print because of you. The response to Jacob's harangue by one of the young writers is immediately to apologize, though insincerely, Jacob detects, since all he wanted was for me to calm down and not embarrass him. This is given some credence when the other young writer pitches in that, quote, he tried to watch as many AIDS movies as possible and wishes he could have seen Rent on Broadway, and asked if Jacob by any chance saw the original production of Angels in America. Here we see in several texts a terrible frustration that not only has the younger generation no clue or care about the AIDS crisis that decimated a generation before them, but a belief that knowledge of some of the cultural texts that emerged from the crisis will do as a placeholder for that experience or knowledge. Now, I've written about Angels in America in the past, and I guess I will have to again, because several of the texts really do refer to it as the thing that might have been the saving cultural production that will allow them to understand something. Anyway, I'm going to have to investigate that. Although this talk calls attention to an anger that emerges in survivors of the AIDS crisis towards a younger generation, anxieties about generational divides precede the aftermath of the AIDS crisis. The AIDS crisis itself contains such preoccupations. With these distinctions repeatedly rendered both during and after the crisis, it could be said that AIDS produces generationality among gay men at the same time that it laments its rupture. Homosexuality has never historically been considered generational. In fact, it was always believed to obviate the possibility of progeny and was not thought of in white communities, as I shall expand upon presently, as familial. In other work, I have suggested that homosexuality is anti-generational. I wrote in this other piece, quote, gay identity, this is an essay I wrote on Fun Home, the graphic memoir, so it wasn't specifically about AIDS, but there I wrote, gay identity, unlike race or ethnicity, is not an identity passed down in the blood across the dinner table or as a legacy from generation to generation. The opposite often pertains. Many parents repudiate their offspring for being gay. With most disenfranchised identities, home is the safe place. With gay identity, that is often simply not the case. When I suggest that the AIDS crisis produced generationality in gay male culture, we must recognize that there was a culture within that in which generationality features quite prominently. So Black and Latinx ballroom culture of the 1980s and 1990s in Harlem, Detroit, and other urban environments consisted in competitions between houses, which were made up of families headed by designated mothers and fathers and their children. We could refer to these, as is often the inclination of in the nomenclature of queer culture, as chosen families, but their evolution, while not biological, which not all conventional families are after all, are often more organic and evolved more complexly than choice suggests. In fact, at least one scholar points out that ballroom culture families instead illuminate the ways all family formations are political. The one important way in which they count as alternative families, however, are the ways that they became havens for young, queer, sometimes HIV-infected Black and Latinx kids who were rejected by their families of origin. That the evolution of these families were not a direct reaction to HIV and AIDS. They nevertheless were integrally part of the world of AIDS, both in providing the haven I mentioned, but also in its activist resistance and engagement, and finally also in how disproportionately devastated this world was. AIDS produces generationality, therefore, in gay culture generally, but not always in the same way or for the same reasons. And this is something obviously I'm still working out. In Christodora, Tim Murphy's 2016 novel, we see a more normative version of family in that it centers on a heterosexual couple, Jared and Millie, and tells the story of the AIDS crisis through them and through their adopted son, Mateo. Though Mateo is not white like his adoptive parents, but Latino, born in the midst of the crisis to Isabel, a Dominican woman who died of AIDS. As it spans the years from the early 1980s to 2021, it is a tale not just of the past, but follows the crisis into its projected consequences. In other words, it ends in the near future of the time that it's written, including the meth crisis that followed in the wake of the emergency years of the AIDS crisis. For many people with AIDS, the pharmaceutical cocktail saved lives, but did not provide the means to reckon with the anguish of existing for so long on the verge of death, and at the same time enduring the countless deaths of loved ones and comrades. So this exchange comes near the end of the novel. You know, says Carl, leaning forward, the work isn't done. There are millions of people around the world who can't access cure therapy. I know, Mateo says, nodding respectfully. I read that. Then Hector says, let him go, Carl. He came here to find out about his mother, not to get recruited. And you don't want to say it, but you know it. It's over. AIDS is over. You won. There's plenty else to do. But, and here Hector goes into sarcastic sing-song, fucking AIDS is over. We're the last fucking ghosts from the AIDS days. We won the war, Carl. Christodora is a story about how no one really survived the AIDS crisis. If, as this last sentence and many other texts have suggested, AIDS was our war, or Vietnam, and in fact, more people died in New York in the AIDS crisis, over 81,000 than all Americans who were killed in the whole Vietnam War, over 58,000. There has been no reparation, no veterans organizations, no official attention to and calculation of our vast losses or succor for our profound suffering, no recognition. Marriage equality came so quickly on the heels of the cessation of the emergency years of the crisis to suggest the obvious conferment of singular attachment and connection as an answer, as a cure. It is not, but for many it has felt like one. The grasping of some autonomy and public recognition for private feelings and loyalty and commitment out of the jaws of abysmal negligence and forgetting. Quote, why doesn't it feel like we won then? Carl asked quietly at the end of the above passage. Among the rageful texts that I am examining here, the one that enacts the anger, but also does most to provide a possible solution to what a younger generation of gay men might do to assuage or at least somewhat mitigate the resentment of an older generation of survivors of the AIDS crisis, is portrayed in the 2017 independent film After Louis, made by Vincent Gagliostro. Sam, the protagonist of the film, is an artist, a painter, but is turning his talents to video to commemorate his friend Louis, shown in early era video cam footage at the beginning of the film. Sam is frustrated not only because he finds memorializing his friend so painful and difficult, but because he is sensitive to the ways the people around him are not as pained by the past as he is. Indeed, some because they were too young to have experienced it. When he begins an affair with Braden, Sam is momentarily distracted, but subsequently angrier than ever when he realizes how little Braden knows about or cares about the past that Sam's art and adulthood were forged in. Over a meal in a diner, when Braden, almost 30, wonders aloud if in betting him Sam is trying to recapture his youth, Sam replies, when I was your age, younger, all my friends were dying, dropping like flies. I went to funerals twice a week, so yeah, I guess I am trying to recapture my youth. When Sam says, we fought for things that really mattered, Braden asks, like what? Like healthcare, Sam retorts, and the right to be a dirty fag and to fuck who and how we wanted. We fought against the church and the FDA, and we were really getting somewhere. And nowadays, your generation, you don't do anything. And After Louis, unlike any of the other texts, we get in what is the turning point, the high fury of the film, the acknowledgement from Braden to Sam, a sincere expression of gratitude. It comes near the end of the film. Sam has alienated nearly all of his friends, An extremely moving scene of fury and creativity and grief, Sam paints all night the names of the dead he knew on his studio wall. And many of those names are names that we know who have died. I mean, it's part of why it's so moving. And I'm speaking to a few in the room who are my ACT UP comrades, who, whether or not they know the film, certainly will know the names on that wall. In this scene, a gathering the morning after the wild painting of names, Sam says, "You take it for granted how easy you have it, how easy you think you have it." Braden replies, "Is that why you brought us here, so you could get up on your little soapbox and tell us that we're not living right? We're not doing it right? You know something, Sam? Who needs another AIDS movie anyway? Right? AIDS was scary. We get it." As though in response to or anticipation of all the other texts mentioned here in this talk, Sam despairs that his history will be conveyed only in cultural media. He says, "You can watch all the movies, you can read all the books, and you can take every fucking queer theory class you want." "Right," Braden responds, finishing Sam's thought. "I'll never understand." And like Walter in The Inheritance, he sees that Braden cannot ever really know it or understand without having been there. He says, "I don't think you ever will. If you'd gone from the hospital room to a memorial service to trying to help someone not lose their apartment, to a demonstration, to another funeral, to this," Braden rejoins, "do you want me to thank you for being there, for surviving, for fighting? Thank you. I mean it. Thank you." And then adds a remonstration from the younger generation to the older. "Why can't you focus on the progress that you've created? Things are changing. They're different. They're better. They're good. If I want to have nasty leather sex, I can do that. I can do it safely without any shame. I can live with my HIV positive partner, and we don't have to be scared about when he's going to die. You did that, Sam. You did that for me, for us, for everyone." This culmination and recognition, both Braden's sincere thank you and Sam's all-night frenzied inscribing of names of people he knew who died in the AIDS crisis, exposes and enacts the desperate wish for memorials, and can also be read as an indictment of how little naming and memorializing there has in fact been. While this is true of trauma generally, that a generation who has survived a devastation believes the kids will never understand what they went through, World War I or II, the Great Depression, even women's liberation, we see through the AIDS crisis a way that now gay men are like everyone else. They have had an experience that makes them resentful old men. In this stereotypical way, and while AIDS seems to have forged generationality and therefore another entree into another grand narrative formerly not available to them, we also see the particularity of AIDS. That, for example, the crisis was definitional. It consolidated an identity, a gay identity, perhaps very roughly parallel to the way Women's Lib consolidated a feminist identity. And further, as a crisis, it went formally uncommemorated as a national cataclysm. And I'm going to say a little bit now towards the ending about that. The neglect and turning away of glances from the anguish of AIDS as evidenced in mainstream obituaries that so effectively and persistently occluded AIDS as the cause of death and any real loved ones as the survivors did not disappear when the emergency years of the AIDS crisis were over, or even when rafts of new legislation seemed to wipe away the homophobia and shame of the AIDS years and all of the homophobic history leading up to it. On the contrary, that the AIDS crisis and the many deaths from AIDS are still unrecognized, not only among gay men or the wider queer community, but continues to be ignored and go unrecognized by the public at large, including still the US government, is evident, for example, in the ways that the tragedy of AIDS, unlike almost any other national tragedy, has been so woefully under-commemorated. Sarah Schulman puts it very starkly when she compares the way the United States has commemorated the losses from the attacks on 9/11 and those from the AIDS crisis. Quote, 81,542 people have died of AIDS in New York City as of August 16th, 2008. These people, our friends, are rarely mentioned. Their absence is not computed and the meaning of their loss is not considered. Since Shulman illuminated this stark distinction in 2012, there have indeed arisen several AIDS memorials, but in many ways, these gestures prove the neglect rather than expunge it. Quote, "It's only in the last couple of years that permanent AIDS memorials have been appearing in American cities," Masha Gessen writes in 2018 in an article about the AIDS memorial, quote, "a giant stone slab in Provincetown, Massachusetts, that is, quote, remarkable for what it omits," including the very word gay or the details that would make clear why Provincetown was a place where people with AIDS would be or come to or die in. They came, Gessen fills in, because their own parents wouldn't touch them, and neither would their doctors and nurses who put on gloves and sometimes hazmat suits before entering the room of an AIDS patient. That there's another memorial in Provincetown, a quote, 250-foot pilgrim monument that towers over Provincetown, indeed almost directly over the new AIDS memorial, Gessen calls a study in omissions. An AIDS memorial in New York City similarly contains no direct reference to AIDS. Where Shulman remonstrates is our wall of white marble with the names of every New Yorker who died of government neglect, and blank tablets with room for more to come, surrounding a white marble fountain spouting water the color of blood. Where, she continues, is our Nuremberg trial? Where is our catharsis, our healing? Where is our post-traumatic stress diagnosis? Where is our recovery? Shulman's cry, "Where is our permanent memorial?" has not been adequately answered if permanence is to be found in geography, in structure, in stone and marble. Rather, the National AIDS Memorial is in culture. Anne Cvetkovich, in her 2003 book, An Archive of Feeling, anticipated this very idea, that public acknowledgement of the trauma of AIDS will come through culture. Quote, "Public recognition of traumatic experience has often been achieved only through cultural struggle, and one way to view AIDS activism, particularly in the 1980s, is as the demand for such recognition." End quote. That the memorial to AIDS, I should put that the memorial to AIDS in the United States might be found in the arts, in the very texts I have been scrutinizing here and myriad others as well, is a tempting conclusion. That the quilt is literally a fabrication of so many of those lost and their loved ones, that many AIDS memorials are purposely ethereal, living memorials, Gessen calls them, such as AIDS Gardens, or in San Francisco, an AIDS Grove, were launched starting in the late 1980s in more than a dozen cities around the country. And that even after a very long lag, the AIDS crisis continues to be portrayed in plays and novels and poems and memoirs, like Ron Goldberg's, and visual art, including, I didn't give you that name, Ron Goldberg, because I didn't know he was coming, including paintings and photographs and films, suggest both a desperate wish to see the crisis recorded, remembered, and inscribed in history, and the ephemerality of such inscriptions. Such cultural texts are essential to ongoing popular and personal reflection, yet they do not function as formal recognition. They are not, how to put this, official. There is, even in the constellation of these texts, no apology, no gratitude, no legitimate public acknowledgement. Names set in stone might not be the ultimate answer, yet names set in stone often reflect what a culture values, and therefore, by virtue of tradition, of habit, functions as civic recognition. There is, after all, no actual capturing what has been lost in the AIDS crisis. As we understand from Freud's rendering of melancholia, here is no simple finite loss. It is unending, not only because governments and publics don't care, and not only because so very many people died. It is unending because the loss is also an abstract loss, the loss of an ideal. And here I'm really quoting Freud from his theory of melancholia, that it's not just the loss of actual people, but also of an ideal. And that ideal, I suggest, is the concept of community, queer kinship and radical friendship, that were perhaps not ever necessarily fully real or achieved, yet still existed as a lived fantasy. That it was sometimes lived as a tenuous stitching together of connection in the dearth of often painfully wished for, more normative connection, family, civic life, etc. Community nevertheless became much more than the consolation prize. That marriage for gays became the solution instead of, say, fighting for the dissolution of marriage for everyone else. That is, letting everyone else in on the ideal of queer kinship is the disappointing consequence of a gay world that was decimated by the absence of what such public recognition conferred: healthcare, hospital visits, family acceptance, celebration, inheritance. The three primary texts I have interrogated here are, in their anger, anti-nostalgic. They are indeed invested in remembering the past, though not in glorifying it, rather insisting on commemorating it. After Louis, that film begins with unresolved grief, grainy video footage of Louis dead from AIDS, which Sam is attempting to edit into a memorial film of his friend. And only then does he launch into resentment and anger and deranged, rageful grief. Later, even those who were his comrades in the crisis have moved on from remembering and commemorating those losses and the ideals of activism and queer community. Over drinks at a friend's home, Sam learns that his close friend Jeffrey has married his boyfriend Mateo. He responds to their announcement, "It's shocking. I'm in shock." When the friend counters, "Can't you even act like you're happy for us?" Sam replies scathingly, "Okay, sure. To Jeffrey and Mateo, congratulations. Congratulations on becoming fully fledged proponents and shining examples of heteronormativity." It is important in this regard that the lost Louis of the film, the friend whose loss Sam keens over, was not Sam's lover, but his comrade, his friend. It exposes the ways non-normative intimacies were both common and profound in the queer community, and as in this case, prized above the couple. Quote, "The community is dead," Sam laments to his young lover earlier in the film, literally as well as figuratively. "There used to be such a brotherhood, and now you young gays just aren't interested." What might look like nostalgia, even in this film, for the past, turns out to be a longing for the kind of community that the AIDS crisis mobilized. It existed before AIDS, and then the crisis practically formalized it. Activist affinity groups, hospital and home visitation rosters, for example. And if the AIDS crisis produced generationality in the gay world, as I have proposed here, then it therefore paradoxically produced family. Post-AIDS crisis rage may have produced the very queer affiliation that these representations of anger conflagrate over being lost.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And I tried to keep it short, but it felt very long.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was fascinating. And I have a lot of questions, but I want to open it up for a conversation. So questions, comments, feelings in response to Monica's discussion of these ideas.
Okay, I have a few thoughts that have irked me for a long time, and that's why I'm so glad we're talking about the generational thing. You know, I had this conversation with Sarah Schulman, but I'm just going to throw them out there. And these are all like 20 years old. James County, for using the word tranny, and this is a decade and a half ago, maybe more. 100 so-called trans activists were so offended, they put together a petition, got her banned from out.com and advocate.com. Jane in 1972, Wayne was appearing in drag, literally had gotten shot at for doing that. And these are the people who should be prostrating at her feet for they're having freedom to live the way that they want in 2023 and shooting their mouth off. Michael Musto gave a whole column, probably about 2002, to some kid who was rather were trending, I guess, at the time. And he was an intelligent kid. But at the end, and one of these days I'm gonna call Musto on this, because he let the kid get away with this. But he had some fantasy, which too many young people believe, and this is exactly what you were talking about, that back, that pre-Stonewall, gay people, stockbrokers, hairdressers, whomever, got together in bars and were sitting around piano bars singing Cole Porter tunes. I'm thinking, maybe you should see something like Advise and Consent. So I wrote him, and I wasn't chastising him. Oh, the thing that he got me irked was he was like spouting the ridiculous myth about Judy Garland's funeral. That's why Stonewall happened, which we know that's ridiculous. So I said, know your history. I remember when our colleague Giancarlo Musto was showing like a fine cut of her piece called Sex in an Epidemic. And during the Q&A, and I was impressed that this kid did, so 20-year-old gay kid got up, he was in tears. He said, I had no idea what you people went through. And two quick thoughts. I remember meeting some kid, I want to talk to you at 5 in the morning. He was a gay kid, and he said he's an AIDS orphan. He's like 20, his mother was a junkie, and he was an AIDS orphan. And that kind of blew me away. And then this whole concept that's been around for too long, and we were there, we're not being nostalgic. I mean, that's just an insult.
Yeah, thank you, Dean. I mean, that's also reinforcing a lot of the things that are happening in these cultural texts. I mean, it's interesting to me that some of it really does resonate outside of the text, but some of it really doesn't also, right? A lot of people to whom I've suggested these things are resistant to the fact that generations are at odds with each other. But you are suggesting that know your history is the way to fix it, right? And not just watch a production of Rent or Angels in America. And that's not the answer. But the fact that these texts keep coming up, I think also suggests that there are there's a kind of hope for the promise of what something like that can do to answer the problem. You say know your history, and we have to think about, well, how will we teach that history? Is it through a great film or a great play, or are we expecting them to come to seminar rooms to hear about it? It's hard to know how to answer that. But one thing that I'm also hearing is that here we have what is probably an age-old frustration of older people who are hearing younger people not know what happened to them. So that's what I'm also grappling with. Is this the sort of standard thing that happens to us, or is there something very particular in this case about the AIDS crisis? And I think it's both, but also that very much something about AIDS. Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
Hi, yeah, I think when you were talking about, this is not history that's passed across the kitchen table. I mean, that's something I'm very aware of. I grew up Jewish. I learned all about the Holocaust. There was, between my family and World War II and, Hebrew school and everything else. We are the first post-Stonewall generation of gay men to reach, I'll be kind and say middle age, but older than that. Exactly. I'll be 130. But so we don't have the institutions. We don't have, we're trying to build, whether it's in colleges through, queer studies, but queer theory isn't queer history. Those are different things. Maxine used to talk all the time about, academics who would talk about queer theory, and it has nothing to do with what was on the street.
Right, but even Maxine acknowledges, this is Maxine Wolf we're talking about, and I now know and say to my students that queer theory came out of activism.
Oh, yeah.
Right, so it may not appeal to activists or what happens on the street. It may not instruct or help with what happens on the street. But the contrary is certainly the case,
Mhm.
that AIDS activism and other activism at that time created queer theory.
That was Princeton.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of how that happened, I mean, many people in this room and in the virtual room might know this. But of course, AIDS and AIDS activism changed the discourse from who you are to what you do, right? We needed to change the discourse in order to make safe sex education possible. That change in discourse is what queer is, right? That it's not about who you are, it's not about identities, it's about performance. It's about how you behave and engage in the world. So literally, AIDS created queer theory and created queer as a concept. We did that.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Steve. I have a question for you about COVID. So for all of the ways that there's been either an interruption in a passing down of history, or if not an interruption, then an inability to pass along certain kinds of history across generations of activeness. Something happened with the pandemic, with the COVID pandemic, that I imagine, actually, let me ask you this. When did you write this? Very recently?
Yeah, pretty recently.
Okay, so let me pose this as a question to you. Because in so many ways, at least in the US, there were some of us who were saying the responses to the COVID pandemic were actually informed by not only HIV activism generally, but by those same catalysts of rage and fear and death and vulnerability and so many of the things that we would name to characterize
And the government not caring.
and the government not caring. So I wonder if you can say a little bit about how there actually is something that in the last two years, 3 years, I don't even know how long anymore. But there is some discourse about how the responses to the COVID pandemic have their roots in the HIV pandemic. And then some might argue too that the HIV pandemic had some roots in women's advocacy around health and.
Completely,
That's right.
Completely.
So I would argue that. too,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
need to say it gently. So I wonder if you could speak to the parts of the story that are about where history may have gotten passed down and it's kind of bubbled up in this most recent context.
Yeah, well, I mean, on one hand, I have things to say and have thoughts to share about that, like that we tried to say in the AIDS crisis that AIDS is everyone's problem and anyone can get it. And it's not just small constituencies or demographics that need to be worried about it. And that COVID made that true in the sense that, but since my work is on the ways that cultural texts sort of erupt with a kind of new reaction or understanding of something, I haven't seen that in the sense of how COVID comes up. And there have been some COVID films or COVID motifs in TV, but not very much. And it's so fresh that it's not really a response to it. It's kind of a burbling up. So yes, I have thoughts about that, sort of historical, political, sociological thoughts. But in terms of how culture is responding, I'm not seeing that. And in fact, the fact that there are these few texts that I've found from around 2016 to 2019, of these eruptions of anger and rage against younger generations from older generations, it's just interesting to me, right? I don't think I have discovered how angry gay men are. I don't think I've discovered anything about people in the world. But I think something's happening in this cultural pot, and I'm fascinated by that. And it might be, on the contrary, a way of kind of catharsis or a way of dispelling it or a way of illustrating it large in a way that is not happening, but as a way of working something out. You know, this has been my work for years, is what does literature or film or any cultural text, what is it doing? You know, why is one of the first things, you know, the question that drove me to write that book on AIDS literature is why the Holocaust, for example, had a lag of decades before people created art about it. And in fact, there was an idea that you oughtn't to make art about the Holocaust. It was too terrible. And the AIDS crisis, immediately, there were poems, plays, novels, and I know they're not the same, but some devastation, some trauma experiences create a kind of delay. And in fact, the definition of trauma is that there can't be an immediate response. And some create the immediate need to respond to it in culture. Now, I tried to answer that in that book. I tried to at least respond to that, but it's been my driving question and I don't have a final answer. You know, what is this stuff doing? A play, a TV show, a film, a novel?
This talk just brought a lot up, Monica. I was thinking, you know, I mean, I've been a high school teacher 27 years and 25 of those years. I've led the queer group on campus, you know, with these kids, and they would they'd say, I don't know, one would say, oh, you know, oh, Rent's at the movie. Can we go to see Rent? You know, okay, I'd grab my husband, we go to see Rent, you know, whatever. And then they had questions about, oh, you lived through the AIDS crisis. And I remember being caught in between, you know, wanting to educate them, certainly tell them things. And then the part of me that was like, I didn't want to tell them everything. How horrible, you know, you want to educate them, but you know, and it just got me thinking also about, I don't know why, but your talk, some of the text you referenced was my uncle, my father's sister married a guy in World War II. And you know, these earlier cataclysmic events, you know, devastating event. And he had Pacific Theater in 53, you know, he survived. He had a girl, he and my aunt had 9 kids, girl, 7 boys, girl. And when he I think when he was about 80, he found a replica of the plane he flew in, and all 7 boys got up and they flew. And I was thinking about how, you know, not just my uncle, but all these folks who were in the war, they didn't want to talk about it. It was too devastating, and everybody respected that.
Yeah.
You know, how I also didn't want to talk about
Yeah.
everything. But there's always, as you said, there were memorials to things like that, you know, or the Holocaust. There are memorials and names, you know, but you know, where is the memorials to this? And I'm not sure. We're not in touch with it, those films, but you know, really.
That's so interesting. 2 things, Chris. I mean, one is the fact that you didn't want, as a teacher, I guess, as a person who cares for these students, didn't want to give them the full picture of how awful it was. And that made me think, well, maybe that's something that art does for us, right? We don't have to pass on the history. We don't have to say, know your history, because we can just let that
Right,
happen.
yes.
But you brought up something else, which is, the stuff that doesn't get talked about.
Mm.
And, you know, when I was explaining this project to a historian friend, a historian colleague, her first question is, well, why then? What was happening then between 2016 and 2019 that made those come out then? And I'm not a historian, although I do try and think about how, you know, about the historical context. And I don't know the answer to that, but your question, you're pointing out that there are things that culturally can't be talked about or that can't be aired, but then there's a national recognition of it, so somehow it doesn't have to be. That's really interesting, that the ways that different registers are responding to pain and devastation. Very, very interesting. It sounded like you had a response to that.
Since I already talked, I don't want to. Well, a couple of things. One is, I think, the work that came out during AIDS, sort of one piece, activism, those pieces didn't start to come out until about 10 years ago.
Right, no, quite.
We weren't,
absolutely.
the survivor literature culture did not come out until, I mean, not to give it importance, but certainly, you know, when the documentaries came out, that How to Survive a Plague
2012.
and 12 and United in Anger came out at the same time. And suddenly, I know for those of us, you know, it was sort of like a box was opened for a lot of us that we sort of, you know, shoved under the bed. And people started to deal with it. I actually, you know, got a chance to talk after some of the films and, you know, it allowed people to start to talk about it. People would come up and instead of questions, it would always be their experiences and what happened. And you had a sense that they hadn't talked about it in 20 years.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. So I think there is a trauma and that's now, we're now past, you know, at that certain point where, oh, we can start to.
Yeah, there is a delay after all, is what you're saying, and I'm right. Again, different registers are responding to it, that there could be plays and poems and novels and not films incidentally for longer after there was a longer gap.
Mhm.
But you're saying that there is a kind of delay after all in terms of what kind of, well, the history of it, the literal history of it,
And the survivor.
the survivor, right, the survivor, yeah.
The survivor story took long because also there's so much guilt involved with that. There's trauma, there's also guilt.
Yeah.
And it takes a while to both process that and put that, and also control. I mean, you said, you know, for a lot of people, suddenly your life is back. Even for those of us who were active and were not positive, we put our lives on hold.
Yeah, and of course, as you guys were joking about, you know, middle age is that we're all reaching a certain age. Roughly, we're all reaching a certain age, right? We weren't all exactly the same age, but we're of,
Yeah.
to use my own term, of a certain generation. Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, you know, Ron Goldberg has written this wonderful and important memoir of ACT UP called The Boy with the Bullhorn. And when it was launched in New York a few months ago, I made a point of delaying my return to the UK in order to go. And I wanted to be at the, you know, in that room with you and celebrate the book, but I also couldn't resist being, it was at the Lesbian and Gay Community Center, as it was called then, where the ACT UP meetings were, and I wanted to go be in that space and with my old comrades, right, and with you. So, yeah, what you're saying really rings true very much. Yeah.
We have a question from our YouTube watchers. Marion posted, I'm in Florida and Governor DeSantis has begun a new McCarthyism around Black and gay history. I'm wondering about your thoughts about these censorship reactions. What in our success in celebrating our queer community and kinship influenced this backlash and a new hatred of the people who struggle for intersectional liberation?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for tuning in from Florida. That's cool, and condolences on what you're suffering. I don't know the answer to that. I could speculate on the waves of history, and I have thought that there was a gap in an interest in AIDS, and then we've come back to a real interest in it, right? I couldn't get my book published for a long time, and now there's a lot of interest in it, right? So there was that. So I don't know if I can comment on what has caused this backlash, but I do know that there's an activist response to it, Marianne, and that education, that censorship as an educator and as an activist is worse than anything I can think of. It is fascist to, you know, the highest degree. That's exactly how you succeed in taking control, is by preventing education to happen and questioning to happen and communication and engagement. So the way to respond to it is, you know, I was saying earlier and talking with Ron that, you know, when I give talks on activism about the past and as a kind of workshop on how to do it now, I always say that besides the massive street demonstrations that you see in the footage of ACT UP and Queer Nation and Lesbian Avengers, there were a lot of actions that just a few of us were doing, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of us were doing at a time. And that's exactly the sort of activism you can do around education and banned books. That is the sort of stuff that you can gather in small groups to read and discuss and teach and know the history and know the literature. So I took advantage of your question to rabble rouse, but I really do understand what's at stake there, and I hope that we all will fight it.
I mentioned that I have.
Oh,
lots of
yes, Laura,
questions.
go ahead, yes.
I want to return, you said, that you wanted to return to Angels in America as this text that keeps coming up again and again in these other cultural
Yeah.
texts that you're studying. And, you mentioned that, it's framed sometimes as a saving cultural production, but in the quotations that you read to us, it sounds more like it is this sort of, it's annoying that it's the one lingering cultural production, the one cultural memory that in, even in its length and complexity, oversimplifies the reality of that time,
Yeah.
right? And so everybody thinks that their job is done if they've read Angels in America.
Yes, I think that it's a failed fantasy object, so that any fantasy object fails. So it's not that it particularly fails, but that because of its complexity, as you say, in its length and its success, it sort of stands as an object of hope that it can communicate, that it can convey, that it can historicize, and that and it can capture something. And I think that might be why it comes up again and again in these texts of, I think it comes up as a disappointment, but because it's in all of them, it means that there was hope in it that it hasn't quite met.
But it's interesting to me that it's sort of a dry joke, right? So it's
Yeah,
pulling
that's true.
in a kind of humor in the anger that, like, so it's bringing in another affect, right?
Well, not only that, but I didn't say, but I do in a footnote that the character Stephen Spinella, who is fulminating in that scene in Tales of the City, was the original prior in the original Angels in America. So it's almost like a double holding on to Angels in America.
Yeah.
And in that light, the Louis in the film After Louis is played by David Drake, and he wrote and acted in the play The Night Larry Kramer Kissed Me. So there's a kind of layered reference there as well. But it also shows the way that Tales of the City is a mainstream production, and After Louis is really an independent one. And in fact, the director of After Louis, Vincent Gagliostro, was a member of ACT UP New York with us. So, you know, that's just.
So it's Stephen.
And so was Stephen Spinella, that's right. So the fact that Stephen Spinella is saying, you think you know your history because you saw Angels in America is also funny.
Yeah.
It's funny.
It's an inside joke.
Yeah, it's an
Right.
inside joke.
Yeah.
That's right.
And it seems like maybe it's sort of solidifying Kramer, Angels in America, and a certain group of folks as in a kind of hagiography or something, and that is both a memorialization,
Yeah,
but also it, like you were talking about with like physical memorials, it also leaves out so much.
yeah. And you know, I would rather have culture be the memorial than the stone slab, but even in hearing this talk again, as I was reading it, I can see how much culture itself is the sort of hope for fantasy object and the failed fantasy object. You know, that you want culture, you know, culture has the chance to be more complex and more alive and it repeats, so it can fix what failed in the past or whatever. The next production could do it better or differently, or another reading will reveal more. But even that is always a failed object because it's not enough to convey to people who weren't there. And you know, that scene in The Inheritance, which, you know, I thought that play didn't, I thought that was the most moving scene in the play, let's put it that way. You know, sort of exposes both the attempt, I mean, I find that scene very, very moving because of how long it is and how many people it mentions. I mean, lists always sort of destroy me anyway. I mean, if you've ever been at a reading of the names at the AIDS Memorial Quilts, you'll understand that also. But that's all he can do to convey to the younger character. That's all he can do. But that's where we are, right? We can't do more than tell a story. And stories are the only ways that we can try and save ourselves and save others.
I think we have time for one more question.
Well, I was just gonna make an observation, I spent many years and have spent many years talking to high school students, some college students, one way or another, the younger crowd that we're all talking about. And sometimes I had a specific assignment to sort of set the table for this group that didn't go through it, to tell them what it was like when we were going through it and stuff like that. And it's the personal story that was the thing that was the hook that always got them. I would start with a picture of a New Year's Eve party I had with, 15 people, and I would fill them all up and tell stories about how wonderful we are in one way or another. And then I would say, and how many of these people do you think might have been sick in this? Well, 9 of the 15 were gone in 3 years, and they were all my best friends. And you could see the shock on their faces as they contemplated what that could be like, at that point in your life, I was in my 20s kind of thing. So I think that education, the more we can really tell our stories, the more we can educate the younger people. They can identify with the feelings if you set the table correctly, I think.
I have permission.
Yes,
Yeah.
permission, sneak in one more question.
What is next for you in this trajectory of looking at rage and history and text?
Oh, gosh, that's a great question. I mean, again, there's a lot that I've left out here. I have a whole section, for example, on, so you haven't asked me what I left out, but it's part of this sort of bigger
Do you want me
project.
to?
No. Yeah, well, there's a whole section on AIDS obituaries, in fact, as the kind of obverse of the AIDS memorial, I guess. It's sort of what is gone, that wasn't mentioned, that wasn't said. I mean, I said that in here, but there's even more to say about what that meant. I think there's a lot more to say. I need to figure out something. As I said, I'm not a historian. And the stuff about generations, I need to figure out how right I am about that, right? No one has challenged me on that here today, but, did AIDS produce generationality in gay men? I think it maybe did in a certain way. I think maybe we didn't think of ourselves, and I just include myself in the queer community, as generational in that way. But we seem to now, because now that I'm alerted to that term, I see it everywhere, right? What the next generation doesn't know, or the previous generation had to go through. So that's the stuff I'm looking to think about. So the rage and anger is really interesting to me, but so is the generation stuff. And the other thing that I've noticed, and through talking with people and through my own research, is that anger is remarkably under-theorized. I mean, we have theories of aggression, and we have, of course, theories of shame, because queer theory really has engaged with shame. But of the affects and emotions that have been studied and have been theorized, anger is really not among them. And I wonder so either anger is not an affect or emotion in the way that the others are, or there's something so scary about anger that we haven't gone there. And ACT UP in some ways was so effective because it was so angry, and it was absolutely earth-shakingly frightening to people. And that's what we corralled and galvanized and used to try to end the illness process.
Great, I think this is a good place to wrap up, and thank you so much, Monica, for this amazing work in progress, which is really quite polished, if you ask me. Also want to thank our ASL interpreters who are keeping up with and our board member, Deborah Biswas, who is moderating the YouTube, all of our viewers on YouTube, and all of you who came and braved the rain to show up today in person. Thanks to everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Thanks very much.